Hey everybody, Mr. Duker back again today with a new video, this time on a very controversial subject, which is the use of the atomic bomb in World War II. Luckily, knock on wood, the United States is still the only country in the world who's ever used an atomic bomb on somebody else, and let's hope it stays that way, but it's still very controversial for reasons that we'll see. And it's a topic that people like to debate today. Basically, was the United States justified in dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end the war? Or was there a different alternative to try and finish the war without having to use these horrible weapons on a bunch of Japanese civilians? There's good answers and arguments for both. And is it a good decision or not? Kind of remains up to you. But today I want to go over the pros and the cons to help you make a better decision and better understand this in your classes. Teachers love to make an assignment out of this because it really involves some critical thinking, and it's a very involved subject. So of course we're talking about the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan to end the war, and here's a picture of them. You have to remember these were brand new technologies. As we'll see, this has never really been done before, and so a lot of this, I don't want to say is trial and error, but the United States is kind of going into uncharted waters here by dropping these 2 weapons, one named Little Man, the other named Fat Boy, as you can probably guess from the 2 pictures, on Japan. It took a long time to make these weapons in secret. It took a lot of money. This all factors into the decision. But ultimately, the reason is World War II, especially in the Pacific, was a very bloody and brutal conflict. One of the last battles of the Pacific War was the United States invasion of Iwo Jima, pictured here, which was an incredibly bloody battle. Iwo Jima was one of the last islands before the United States was ready to invade Japan, and the Japanese knew this. And so they were going to fight on and hold on to this island as long as they could. And when the Americans invaded Iwo Jima, like I said, it was an incredibly bloody battle. I think almost every Japanese soldier on the island died trying to protect it. Very few Japanese soldiers were taken alive, taken prisoner. I think it was only like 55 out of the thousands of men stationed at Iwo Jima. They all fought and died to the last man because, again, they knew the next target would be their home, Japan. This is when we're starting to see kamikaze strikes during the war. The Japanese flying suicide pilots their planes into American ships. The Japanese had always been fanatical in fighting, but here, with their backs against the wall, it reached new heights and new limits, and it scared the hell out of the Americans. Because again, they would not be taken prisoner, and they would go down shooting, and they would not quit, and they would go to great lengths to try and avoid American invasions and an American victory. So it scared the hell out of people, and this was a big reason why the bombs were ultimately dropped, to avoid more brutal bloodshed and fighting on this kind of scale. Again, this is just Iwo Jima. It's an extinct, barren, rocky volcano. How would the Japanese fight to defend their homes? It could get really ugly really fast. Ultimately, the decision rested on new President Harry S. Truman. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is not here anymore. He had recently passed on at the very end of the war. And so his vice president, now President Truman, ultimately it was his decision whether to use the bomb or not. And according to Truman, he had little hesitation about this. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the projections from an invasion of Japan. He knew how bloody this war had been and how much blood was still ready to be spilt to end the war. And so if he saw a quick way to try and finish this war quickly, he was going to take it. In World War I, he was also an artilleryman. He was in the artillery in World War I. And so a lot of people think that had some part into play in this as well. He was he was used to kind of shelling or maybe attacking people from afar. So being an old artilleryman, like I said, if he found a weapon that was going to end this war quickly, he was more akin to use it. What's interesting, though, is that he didn't even know these bombs existed until he became president. This was actually kept a secret while he was vice president. And so he's got a lot on his lap. He's the new president. He's got to try to end this war very quickly. Oh, and by the way, there's this super top secret weapon that we've been developing and kept secret from you. And now it's up to you, Mr. President, if you want to drop the bombs or not. Of course he did. It was Truman's call. And this is what happened. 2 bombs were dropped on 2 Japanese cities. Hiroshima was first, followed soon by Nagasaki. And this was very different from other attacks during World War II. World War II, you saw a lot of civilian cities being bombed, both in Europe and in Japan. So that is not uncommon, as we'll see. But before, raids would be hundreds of planes dropping thousands of bombs. And now, with this new technology, 1 plane, 1 bomb, 1 city. It was destruction on a huge, massive scale that even people in World War II just had a hard time wrapping their heads around. How could one little bomb cause so much damage just like this? So it was a new concept. And you got to remember that at the time, this was new to everybody. And again, that has an effect on the decisions that were made. They really had very little idea. This weapon was kind of rushed out at the end of the war to try and end it. But they just really had no idea the destructive power and the long-term radioactive consequences that would be following. And so this is all kind of new, and they're kind of, I don't want to say making things up as they go along, but this has never really happened or been done before. So what are the reasons for dropping the bomb? Like I said, there are pros and cons. I'm going to do the pros first. The first of all is that, again, an invasion of Japan would have been extremely ugly. So today, we remember D-Day as the largest amphibious invasion in military history. It's a battle that starts at sea and it ends on land. I did a previous video on D-Day if you want to look on my channel. But the invasion of Japan was actually very planned out, and they were ready. Had the bombs failed or not been dropped, this would have been the plan to end the war. They called it Operation Downfall, and this would have dwarfed D-Day. D-Day had, I think, 5 different invasion beaches just in a little strip of France called Normandy. This was all over Japan, 15 different invasion beaches, and it would have totally dwarfed the D-Day landings. And we forget today, this was in the very late stages of planning, and this invasion was pretty much a go if the bombs were going to fail. And so that is a huge problem. But it was already planned out, and it would have been ugly, even uglier than we thought, because Japan was getting ready to resist at all costs and doing everything they could to save their home, protect the emperor, and stop the American invader. Here, these are Japanese schoolgirls. School was canceled, obviously, if your home was going to be invaded. And what they were doing is training these girls to resist American soldiers and fight back with bamboo poles, because that's about the only weapons they had. And so here you can see these girls are in their school courtyard training in front of a bunch of Japanese officers. This is the limits of how far Japan was willing to go. Basically, an invasion of Japan, you would have seen the entire Japanese people basically committing suicide had the invasion gone down. Can you imagine waves of schoolgirls charging American soldiers trying to stab them to death? As a GI, what are you going to do? Let them protect yourself? You would have American young men gunning not only these women, but young kids, and gunning them down in droves in these suicide banzai charges. The death toll would have been astounding had the invasion gone on. And you can imagine what that would have done to the Japanese, but also just the mental damage and fatigue and the wear on Americans having to basically play executioner. We also knew, not until after the war ended, the Japanese had squirreled away a lot of miniature torpedo boats, stockpiling planes, basically suicide boats and planes we didn't even know existed. They had hidden in caves by the ocean. So when the Americans came to land, they would have been met with swarms of basically kamikaze boats and ships, trying to take out, again, as many American soldiers as possible. The invasion of Japan would have been a huge bloodbath and a huge tragedy in human history had it gone down. Japan was literally willing to kill, suicide their entire country to stop the invasion. And a lot of people will also say the bombs aren't that big a deal because we had been bombing Japanese cities already. This is a photo of firebomb attacks made against Tokyo. So a lot of Japanese homes, we realized early, are made of just simple wood structures, and traditional explosives weren't damaging enough because they just blew houses down and that was all. But someone got the bright idea, if you dropped incendiaries, fire bombs, not only would they blow up the homes in the explosion, but you could create huge fires that will spread and end up destroying much of the city. So this had been quite common at the end of the war. So many fire bombs were dropped. They created these huge, literally a firestorm that would sweep through the towns, whip up huge winds, hundreds of miles an hour, suck all the oxygen out of the air because fire consumes air to grow, suffocating people who weren't even next to the fires because there was no oxygen to breathe. Incredibly damaging. And this was something the United States was doing constantly against Japan. So we had no problems dropping bombs and causing massive destruction on civilians and families. We have been doing it for quite a while. I think 100,000 people died in these Tokyo bombing raids, which is actually more than people killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So some people will say we were doing much worse already than atomic bombs. Something else we did is we gave warnings. So in the days before the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American planes flew over and dropped these pamphlets warning the people in the town to basically evacuate and leave because a massive attack was soon coming their way and the city was going to be destroyed. So maybe the Americans in good conscience could use these weapons now because we tried to play fair and give these people a heads up to leave and get out of the way. However, many Japanese didn't read these flyers. You could be arrested if you were found reading one of these or having one of these in your pocket. It was an illegal reading material to be reading these American pamphlets. So many Japanese either ignored them or were just not able to leave because they weren't allowed to, or they were just told these were lies and made up by the Americans to try and fool them into quitting. So that happened. Another reason is that in the final days of the Pacific War, the Soviet Union, now that War of Germany is over, decided to declare war on Japan, and they were getting ready to invade as well. And this could have been quite disastrous because if you look forward in the Cold War, we had we saw a lot of split nations during the Cold War in East and West Germany. A communist Germany and a capitalist democratic Germany, right? We saw North and South Vietnam, North and South Korea. Had the Russians invaded, you could have seen a North and South Japan as well, and a split Japan would have made the Cold War look very, very different. If the Soviet Union was able to kind of get their, I don't say their claws, but get control of some of the Japanese islands, things would have looked quite different as well. So ending the war quickly did not give the Soviets a chance to invade and basically gobble up pieces of Japan for themselves. Now, there's also a lot of arguments against the dropping of the atomic bombs, and one of them, there's many, but the first one here is the Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito here. Towards the end of the war, Japan really had no way of winning. People knew this. They had few planes left, even fewer qualified pilots to fly those planes. which didn't matter because there was very little gasoline to get them in the air, right? They were running out of soldiers. They were arming schoolgirls with bamboo poles, right? They just really had no way to resist and fight back. And many people thought that it was only a matter of time before Japan would kind of wake up and realize the war was lost and end up suing for surrender or quitting the war, and that maybe the emperor was leaning towards that. And had Japan kind of been left to its own devices, they may have just given up and quit already, because any hopes of victory was, again, suicidal. And what's the point of being emperor if you have no country to rule over, right? Another reason, as I said, is the destructiveness. This is, again, the destructiveness of the bombs on Hiroshima. And these bombings were kind of like a test, right? We really hadn't used these before on real cities. And so one reason the Americans wanted to drop the bombs was to kind of test their effectiveness and see what this new weapon was really capable of doing, which sounds very, very callous, but there is actually some good information that backs this up, is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were specifically picked to be targets, not really because they were military targets. As a matter of fact, throughout the entire war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were never attacked by American planes. They were put on a list early in the war to be left alone, because if we were to drop bombs, if the atomic bombs ended up working, we wanted to drop them on, pristine targets, right? There's no point dropping an atomic bomb on a city that's half blown up anyways, because we won't be able to see how powerful the weapon really is. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there were a few others, were kind of left alone. So if they did have to be attacked, we could kind of measure the destructiveness in this giant, twisted scientific experiment. And so that's not a good reason to go and kill a lot of people. But there is truth to that. The United States wanted to see what this new weapon was capable of. Another reason the Americans dropped the bomb, it's argued, is to justify the huge expense and time it took to build the bomb. So the bomb was built in secret with something called the Manhattan Project. I think it was like over $2 million was spent over the course of the war trying to make these bombs that hadn't really existed, and we didn't even know if it was possible. Now that they were proven to work and we had 2 of them in our inventory, what a waste of money it would be if they weren't ultimately used. And so one reason the bombs were dropped is just because that they were made in the first place. A bomb is no good, I guess, if it's not exploded. And so, again, to justify the expense and the time and the secrecy, the bombs were dropped again the bombs were dropped because we had spent so much money on making them, and we wanted to see, I guess, if we got our money's worth. And as I mentioned, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were left alone during the war for this very reason. And so here's a photo of the atomic dome before. Well, it wasn't called the atomic dome back then, of course, but Hiroshima before it was attacked, and then afterwards. Hiroshima was really not a military target. There were way more civilians there than there was military personnel. It was a lot of families. It was, again, a safe place to live because for whatever reason, the Americans never seemed to target it during the war. But unfortunately, when the cities were attacked, it was mostly civilians and families that ended up paying the price. Because, again, they weren't true military targets. It wasn't like a base. There really weren't very many weapon factories there. They were kind of as peaceful as a wartime Japanese city could be. Here again, you can see the scientific experiment, and so you can see where the bomb was dropped, and the circles show the epicenter, and then like a radius or a rippling out from it, you can see the destruction of the bomb and how it ended up covering the city. And again, this was on purpose to see how powerful the bomb could be on a real target. Another reason the bomb was dropped is, again, the Soviet Union had just declared war on Japan. They were an ally of ours in World War II, but very quickly people could see at the end of the war that may not be the case, and they could become an antagonist. They could become an enemy. And so one reason to drop the bomb was to kind of put the Soviets on notice, to watch out, and kind of as a bargaining chip, basically, that the Americans have a powerful new weapon that if things get ugly between us and you, we have something that you don't, basically. It was dropped to intimidate the Soviet Union. Here you can see the major Allied leaders at the Potsdam Conference at the end of World War II. Harry Truman in the middle, Stalin over there in the white jacket. And it was at this conference, I think this conference took place maybe just a day, or maybe I think during the Manhattan Project. Truman was notified that the bomb worked while he was there, and he decided to let Stalin, because they were still friends, kind of know about this little deep, dark secret the United States had been working on. But according to the story, when he told Stalin about the atomic bomb, Stalin simply just replied that he already knew. Because he had spies in the United States or contacts that was letting him know about the successful test. And so the Soviets very much knew what the United States was doing, and they knew the bomb had already worked before Truman let the cat out of the bag. So to intimidate the Soviets is another reason the bombs may have been dropped. And of course, another reason people are against the bombs is just a huge toll of human life. I think, 60,000 people died almost in an instant when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Nagasaki was a little bit smaller than that, but still, those that weren't instantly evaporated and blown away suffered horrible burns and a new effect called radiation, which we didn't really understand at the time. But these bombs are very destructive because it's not just the blast, but there are poisonous side effects that is left behind, and it can get into your body. It doesn't really ever go away, and it can basically poison and sicken you. And so many of these survivors were either horribly disfigured, horribly burned, or in the months and years to come would also end up dying due to radiation sickness that, again, it just stays in the land. It stays in Hiroshima. A lot of birth defects come this way. There's still people dying today from the radiation from that bomb that was dropped at the end of World War II in 1945. So just a huge human toll. And again, it was mostly civilians, women, families, kids that ended up dying in these blasts. And if there was a way to end the war without killing all of them, that obviously would be a very good thing to do. Another reason, which cannot be understated, and just to end here, is the idea of revenge. World War II, Americans had very different attitudes toward the Japanese. Remembering what happened at Pearl Harbor is still very much a thing. And Americans wanted to get revenge for the atrocities Japan had committed for starting this war in the first place. And so a lot of Americans at the time had very little problem, not all, but no real problem to kind of end what Japan had started. And so don't take revenge out of this. That very much probably had a place in this decision, though we may not want to think about that. But again, American attitudes towards Japanese and revenge for Pearl Harbor definitely had at least some small part to play in the decision. And that is it. There's some other arguments for and against, but those are some of the major ones and the bigger ones, and hopefully that kind of clears it up. Again, like I said, there's good arguments on both sides, and ultimately, if it was the right decision, is up to you. These are horrible weapons, and the weapons, the versions we have today are hundreds of times more destructive than the ones used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So hopefully the lesson was learned and we never have to use these again. But again, that's why we study history, so we can make better decisions about the present, but also the future. So do you think it was a good idea or not? You can leave your answer in the comments. You can write it up in your research papers for school. But again, I hope this was a simplified look at this very important debate and hot topic, and very controversial. But probably there's really no right or wrong answer. It just depends on your point of view, as long as you can make an informed decision, right? Okay, that's Mr. Duger. That's all for today. Super Simplified Social Studies. Again, hopefully that was helpful, and I'll catch you later.